Number 10. Project A119. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 establishes a principle that most people assume has always existed. Space is to be used for peaceful purposes. No nation may place weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on any celestial body. This feels like common sense. But in 1958, 9 years before that treaty was signed, the United States Air Force commissioned a classified study with a singular objective to detonate a nuclear warhead on the surface of the moon. The program was designated Project A119. It was run by the Illinois Institute of Technology under the direction of physicist Leonard Riefel. The weapon under consideration was a W-25 nuclear warhead, compact enough to fit atop an intercontinental ballistic missile. The plan was to launch it at the moon, detonate it on or near the surface, and produce a flash and debris cloud large enough to be observed through an amateur telescope from Earth. The purpose was propaganda. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik the year before. The psychological damage to American confidence was severe and immediate. The Air Force needed a spectacle, something that would announce to Moscow and to the world that the United States could project destructive force beyond the atmosphere. A visible nuclear detonation on the moon would have been the single most dramatic act of military intimidation in human history. To model the expansion of a nuclear dust cloud in lunar vacuum, the program brought in a young doctoral student named Carl Sagan. He was 23 years old. His calculations on the optical behavior of the debris plume remain classified in their original form to this day. The program was canceled before a single component was assembled, not because it was immoral, not because it violated any treaty. No such treaty existed in 1958. It was canceled because the Air Force determined that if the rocket malfunctioned during ascent, the warhead would detonate over American soil. The risk was logistical, not ethical. Project A119 was buried. Leonard Riefel kept his silence for 42 years. The public learned of the program's existence only in 2000 when Riefel disclosed it himself. The Air Force has never issued a formal acknowledgement. To put that in perspective, NASA Apollo program, which landed 12 human beings on the moon, is one of the most documented endeavors in American history. But for 4 decades, the government's original plan for the moon, a nuclear detonation visible from Earth, existed in no public record at all. The question is not whether such a program was possible. The question is how many programs like it never had a Leonard Riefel willing to talk. Number 9. Starfish Prime. On July 9, 1962, at 11 o'clock at night local time, the United States detonated a thermonuclear warhead in space. The weapon was a WF-49 with a yield of 1.4 megatons, roughly 90 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was carried by a Thor missile to an altitude of 250 miles above Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. To put that altitude in proportion, the International Space Station orbits at approximately 250 miles. That is how high this weapon was when it detonated. There was no mushroom cloud. At that altitude, the explosion produced something stranger, an artificial aurora. A curtain of red, green, and white light spread across the sky from Hawaii to New Zealand, turning the Pacific night into pulsating color for several minutes. In Honolulu, 900 miles from the blast, people poured into the streets to watch. They were told it was a scheduled rocket test. They were not told what the rocket was carrying. The electromagnetic pulse arrived before the light did. Street lights failed across Oahu. Telephone systems collapsed. Burglar alarms triggered simultaneously in homes and businesses across the island. The military's models for high-altitude electromagnetic effects had been wrong, and the civilian infrastructure of a major American city paid the price. The visible damage was manageable. The invisible damage was not. The detonation injected an enormous quantity of high-energy electrons into Earth's magnetic field, creating an artificial radiation belt wrapped around the planet. This belt was not temporary. It persisted for years, trapped in the Van Allen zone, bleeding charge into anything that passed through it. At least 7 satellites were damaged or destroyed in the months following the test, including Telstar 1, the world's first commercially operational communications satellite, launched just 3 weeks after the blast. Within 6 months, 1/3 of all satellites in low Earth orbit were crippled or dead. The full extent of the satellite destruction was classified. The persistence of the artificial radiation belt was classified. The specific EMP damage to civilian infrastructure was classified. The United States had contaminated an entire region of near-Earth space that it would need for every communications and surveillance satellite it planned to launch for the next decade. It told no one. Operation Fishbowl ended when the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty made atmospheric and exotmospheric detonations illegal in 1963. The classified assessments of what Starfish Prime actually did to the orbital environment remained sealed for decades after that. Number 8. Cosmos 954. Nuclear reactors do not belong in low Earth orbit. This is not a philosophical position. It is a statement of orbital mechanics. An unstable orbit is a countdown, and a nuclear reactor attached to a decaying satellite is a countdown with consequences that reach far below the atmosphere. The Soviet Union understood this principle. They launched nuclear-powered satellites anyway. Cosmos 954 was a Röhrsatellite radar ocean reconnaissance satellite designed to track NATO naval vessels. Its radar array required power that solar panels could not reliably provide, so the satellite carried a BS-5 nuclear fission reactor fueled by approximately 50 kilograms of enriched uranium-235. It launched into orbit in September 1977. By December of that year, its orbit was failing. The satellite carried a safety mechanism for exactly this scenario, a separation system designed to detach the reactor core and boost it into a high disposal orbit before re-entry, where it would remain for centuries until the fuel decayed to safe levels. The mechanism failed. By January 1978, Cosmos 954 was falling intact, uncontrolled, with its reactor still attached toward the surface of the Earth. On January 24, 1978, it entered the atmosphere over northern Canada and broke apart. Debris scattered across 124,000 square kilometers of the Northwest Territories, northern Alberta, and Saskatchewan. That is approximately the size of Austria. Across that entire area, fragments of a nuclear reactor lay in frozen wilderness, some buried in snow, some resting on the surface of frozen lakes, some emitting radiation at levels lethal to anyone who lingered nearby. The joint U.S.-Canadian recovery operation, designated Operation Morning Light, deployed teams across the debris field for months. Investigators found dozens of radioactive fragments, including pieces of the reactor core itself, registering radiation high enough to kill an unprotected person within minutes of exposure. The Soviet Union's response was layered dishonesty. They denied the satellite contained nuclear material. Then they acknowledged it was Soviet but denied the debris was dangerous. Then they minimized the geographic spread and the severity of the contamination. Each statement contradicted the last. None matched the evidence on the ground. Canada invoked the 1972 Space Liability Convention and submitted an invoice for $6,012,000 in cleanup costs. The Soviets paid $3 million. The classified intelligence assessments how much uranium was recovered versus how much remains unaccounted for in the Canadian wilderness were not made publicly available for decades. Cosmos 954 was eventually acknowledged, its consequences eventually quantified. But in the Soviet Union, not all space disasters received even that much honesty. Some were so thoroughly erased that the dead simply ceased to have existed. Number 7. The Nedelin catastrophe. When a ballistic missile's propellant system malfunctions on the launch pad, the protocol is absolute. You evacuate, you depressurize, you wait. These procedures exist because the fuels used in intercontinental ballistic missiles are hypergolic. They ignite spontaneously on contact with each other, without a spark, without delay, without warning. Every engineer at the Baikonur Cosmodrome on October 24, 1960 understood this. They were ordered to ignore it. The RC Skeen was the Soviet Union's first true intercontinental ballistic missile, a weapon capable of reaching the continental United States. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, commander of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, had staked his political reputation on its successful test. When an electrical fault was discovered in the second-stage ignition system, with the rocket fully fueled and pressurized on the pad, his engineers advised a full stand-down. Nedelin overruled them. He ordered the fault repaired in place with the hypergolic propellant tanks loaded. He reportedly had a chair placed near the base of the rocket and sat in it to demonstrate confidence. During the repair, the second stage ignited. The resulting fireball was instantaneous. The propellant's unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, chemicals that burn on contact with each other and on contact with human tissue, engulfed the launch complex in seconds. Personnel near the rocket were incinerated where they stood. Those who attempted to flee discovered that the security perimeter fencing, designed to keep unauthorized personnel out of the restricted zone, now trapped authorized personnel inside. People burned against the fence. The fuel burned on concrete, in drainage channels, across every surface it reached. Marshal Nedelin was killed. So were an estimated 78 others. Some accounts place the toll above 100. The Soviet government classified the disaster completely. Netherlands' death was attributed to a plane crash. Families of the other victims received notifications that omitted any reference to the launch pad, the missile, or the fire. No public acknowledgement was issued. No memorial was built. For 29 years, the Netherlands catastrophe did not exist in any public Soviet record. It was acknowledged for the first time in 1989 during Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost reforms. Even then, the full details, the fencing, the precise death count, Netherlands' role in overriding safety protocol emerged only gradually through survivor testimony collected years after the fact. To put the cover-up in proportion, the Soviet Union maintained a lie about the deaths of 78 people for longer than most of those people had been alive. The man who caused the disaster by demanding speed was among the first consumed by it. That fact was classified for nearly 3 decades. Number 6. The Petrov Incident. On September 26, 1983, just after midnight Moscow time, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat at his station inside a military bunker designated Serpukhov 15, 40 miles south of Moscow. His assignment was monitoring the Oko satellite early warning network, a constellation of satellites in highly elliptical orbits calibrated to detect the infrared exhaust plume of an American Minuteman ICBM launch. If Oko registered a launch, Petrov's duty was to verify the signal and report a confirmed attack to his superiors, who would then initiate a full retaliatory launch. Soviet doctrine was unambiguous: launch on warning. It was not a suggestion. At 0014, the system reported 1 missile inbound from a U.S. base in Montana, then 4 more. 5 American ICBM, according to every sensor the Oko network possessed. Petrov had minutes. The full Soviet retaliatory arsenal, more than 200 intercontinental ballistic missiles, operated on use-it-or-lose-it logic. Delay meant vulnerability. Protocol demanded he confirm and report. He did not. He reported a system malfunction. His reasoning was not emotional. A genuine American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. A first strike aimed at neutralizing Soviet retaliatory capacity had to be overwhelming and simultaneous. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. The Oko system was new, its reliability under real-world atmospheric conditions untested. Petrov judged it a false positive. He was correct. The satellite had misidentified sunlight reflecting off high-altitude cloud formations above North Dakota as the thermal signatures of rising missiles. To put that in scale, the distance between sunlight on clouds and the annihilation of human civilization was one officer's judgment, applied in under 4 minutes in a bunker in the dark. If Petrov had followed protocol, an estimated 200 Soviet warheads would have launched within minutes. American early warning systems would have detected them. Mutual retaliation would have followed. The estimated global casualty count exceeds 300 million. Petrov was not decorated. He was reprimanded for failing to properly complete his duty log during the incident. He was reassigned to a less sensitive post and eventually retired in obscurity. The Soviet government classified the event entirely. The world learned of it only in 1998. When retired General Yuri Votintsev mentioned it in his published memoirs, 15 years after the night, the system told Stanislav Petrov that the world was ending, and he decided alone that it was not. Number 5. The Vela Incident. The Vela Hotel satellites were purpose-built detectors positioned approximately 70,000 miles above the Earth's surface. Their function was singular: identify the optical signature of a nuclear detonation anywhere on the planet. That signature is known as the double flash, a brief, intensely bright pulse as the fireball expands, followed by a second longer, dimmer glow as it cools and rebrightens. No natural phenomenon on Earth replicates this sequence. Lightning does not. Meteorite impacts do not. The double flash is unique to nuclear weapons, and the Vela system had correctly identified it dozens of times across more than a decade of flawless operation. On September 22, 1979, satellite Vela 6911 detected a double flash in the South Atlantic Ocean, near the Prince Edward Islands, an uninhabited archipelago between South Africa and Antarctica. Someone had detonated a nuclear weapon in one of the most remote maritime zones on the planet, and they had chosen that location precisely because it was remote. The leading theory then and now points to a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test. South Africa maintained an active weapons program in 1979, later confirmed and dismantled under international pressure. Israel has never confirmed or denied possessing nuclear weapons. Both nations had the capability, the geographic access, and the political motivation to test clandestinely in a jurisdiction-free zone with minimal monitoring. President Carter convened a scientific review panel led by MIT physicist Jack Rowena to assess the data. The Rowena panel concluded the signal was probably not a nuclear detonation. Their preferred alternative, a zoo event, a micrometeorite striking the satellite sensor at the exact moment it happened to be oriented toward a region where two nuclear-capable nations were conducting unannounced military exercises, producing an optical signal that perfectly mimicked a nuclear blast. Physicists outside the panel found this explanation strained to the point of absurdity. Documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 2000s, drawn from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Air Force Technical Applications Center, revealed that hydroacoustic monitoring stations in the Southern Ocean had detected a signal consistent with a low-yield nuclear detonation at the same time in approximate location. The Rowena panel had not incorporated this data. No nation has ever claimed responsibility. The U.S. government's official position remains inconclusive. The double flash has never been explained by any natural mechanism. Something detonated in the South Atlantic on September 22, 1979. The most sophisticated nuclear detection system ever built recorded it. And 45 years later, the question is not what happened, the satellite answered that. The question is why every government involved has chosen silence over acknowledgement. Number 4. The Malmstrom Incident. Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles are among the most hardened weapon systems ever engineered. They sit in steel-reinforced concrete silos buried 60 feet underground. Their electronics are shielded against electromagnetic pulse. Their power systems carry redundancies upon redundancies. They are designed to survive a nearby nuclear detonation and still launch. A Minuteman missile does not go offline because of weather, power grid failure, or software glitch, and it certainly does not go offline simultaneously with 9 others. On March 24, 1967, all 10 Minuteman ICBM assigned to Oscar flight at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana dropped to a no-go status within seconds of each other. No cascade failure, no power interruption, no fault that Boeing, the system's prime contractor, could identify or replicate in subsequent testing. In the hours surrounding the shutdown, multiple Air Force security personnel at the Oscar flight silos reported an unidentified object hovering in the airspace directly above the launch facilities. The object was described as circular, luminous, and silent, exhibiting no rotors, no exhaust, and no visible means of propulsion. Captain Robert Salas was the Missile Combat Crew commander on duty underground at Oscar Flight. He received a call from the flight security controller on the surface, reporting the object overhead. Within minutes, his launch status board showed the missiles going offline. Salas and his crew had no explanation. No subsequent investigation produced one. He was ordered not to discuss the event and maintained that silence for over 30 years before testifying publicly in 2001. Days earlier, a nearly identical event had occurred at Echo Flight, also at Malmstrom, also involving 10 Minuteman missiles, also accompanied by reports of unidentified aerial objects near the silos. 20 nuclear weapons disabled across 2 flights in 2 incidents within the same week. Boeing engineers investigated both shutdowns at the Air Force's request. They could not reproduce the failure under any test condition: electromagnetic interference, software corruption, power anomaly, or deliberate sabotage simulation. The Air Force's eventual explanation attributed the failures to an electronic noise pulse of unknown origin. The explanation identified a symptom. It did not identify a source. It did not address the objects reported by trained military personnel stationed at the sites. Imagine explaining to the commander-in-chief that 20 nuclear weapons, the backbone of the nation's strategic deterrent, went dark for reasons that your best contractor cannot replicate, at locations where your own security teams reported unidentified objects overhead. The Air Force's response was to classify the reports and say nothing for decades. Number 3. The USS Nimitz encounter. The N/Spy-1 radar system aboard a U.S. Navy Aegis cruiser can simultaneously track over 200 targets across a volume of airspace extending to 80,000 feet in altitude and roughly 200 miles in every direction. It is a phased array system designed to identify and classify ballistic missile threats in real time. It does not produce ghost returns under normal atmospheric conditions. When it tracks something, something is there. For 2 weeks in November 2004, the USS Princeton, an Aegis cruiser operating with the Nimitz carrier strike group off the coast of Southern California, tracked anomalous contacts on its radar. Objects appeared at altitudes near 80,000 feet, descended to sea level, and vanished all within seconds. They appeared repeatedly, without any flight path consistent with known aircraft, drones, or ballistic projectiles. On November 14th, Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich launched from the USS Nimitz to intercept. The Princeton vectored them toward a disturbance on the ocean surface, an area of churning white water the size of a 737, with no visible cause. Above it hovered a white oblong object approximately 40 feet long. No wings, no rotors, no exhaust plume, no visible propulsion of any kind. Fravor descended toward it. The object mirrored his approach, tracking his trajectory with what he later described as reactive awareness. When he committed to a direct intercept, the object accelerated from a dead hover to beyond visual range in under 2 seconds. It reappeared on the Princeton's radar 60 miles away moments later. A second aircraft captured the object on forward-looking infrared. The footage shows an object maintaining a stable heading with O thermal exhaust signature. No engine heat. No atmospheric friction heat. Nothing. The Princeton's tracking data showed the object descending from 80,000 feet to 50 feet above sea level in 0.78 seconds. To put that in human terms, the HEA force required to execute that maneuver exceeds 5,000 times the force of gravity. A trained fighter pilot loses consciousness above 9G. A fighter jet's airframe fails below 15. Whatever performed that descent was not built by any aerospace program on Earth, and it could not have carried a biological occupant. The encounter was classified. Fravor was instructed not to discuss it. The FLIR footage was secured and locked. The Pentagon acknowledged none of it until December 16, 2017, when journalists Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper published their report in the New York Times, and the Department of Defense was forced to confirm the footage was authentic and the objects remained unidentified. 13 years of silence. A 40-foot object that pulled 5,000 G of forces over the Pacific, recorded on military-grade radar and infrared, witnessed by 2 Navy pilots, and the official position for more than a decade was that it had not happened. Number 2. ODIP. For more than 60 years, the official position of the United States government was that unidentified aerial phenomena posed no threat to national security and warranted no federal investigation. Civilian witnesses were dismissed. Military pilots who filed encounter reports were told to move on. The phenomenon, as far as the public record was concerned, did not exist. They were lying. From 2007 to 2012, the Pentagon operated a classified program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. ODIP received $22 million through the black budget, the undisclosed portion of the federal defense appropriations secured by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, with support from Senators Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye. None of the three made public statements about the program while it was active. To put $22 million of classified research funding in perspective, that is more than the annual budget of the National Institute of Justice's entire forensic science portfolio. It was spent studying a phenomenon the government publicly dismissed as not worth studying. The program was managed by Luis Elizondo, a career intelligence officer with the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. A team investigated military UAP encounters, compiled classified threat assessments, and contracted research on physical samples described internally as materials of unknown origin, objects analyzed for anomalous isotopic ratios and structural properties inconsistent with known manufacturing. The primary research contract went to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, a company whose owner, Robert Bigelow, had publicly stated he was absolutely convinced that extraterrestrial visitors had reached Earth. The Pentagon awarded $22 million in classified contracts to a company whose founder held that position. No public explanation was ever offered for the selection. Elizondo resigned in October 2017. His letter to Defense Secretary James Mattis cited excessive secrecy, bureaucratic obstruction, and a failure to address what he characterized as an ongoing national security threat. Within weeks, the New York Times published its Nimitz report, and audit became public. The Pentagon denied the program existed, then admitted it existed but claimed it had ended, then admitted successor programs, the UAP Task Force, RO, had continued the work under different names. Each admission came only after congressional or media pressure forced it. The pattern was identical to the Cosmos 954 denials: deny the existence, then the scope, then the significance, each statement contradicting the last. If you worked in the U.S. military between 1960 and 2017 and reported an encounter with an object that defied known physics, the institution publicly mocked your report while privately spending millions to investigate the same phenomenon. That is not ambiguity. That is policy. Number 1. The Grush Testimony. In June 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Grush filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Intelligence Community Inspector General. Grush had served as a GS-15, the highest non-executive grade in the federal civilian intelligence structure with the National Reconnaissance Office and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He was a decorated combat veteran and a co-lead on the UAP task force. His complaint alleged that the United States government has been operating a multi-decade program to retrieve and reverse engineer craft of non-human origin. He stated that the program operated outside congressional oversight, was funded through mechanisms that bypass standard appropriations, and was compartmented to a degree that most senior defense officials had no knowledge of its existence. The Inspector General reviewed the complaint. The finding was 2 words: credible and urgent. On July 26, 2023, Grush testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee. He stated that individuals with direct knowledge of retrieval operations had come forward to him as sources. He stated that non-human biologics had been recovered at retrieval sites. He provided additional classified testimony in a SIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, to cleared members of Congress who cannot publicly disclose what they were told. Congress responded by drafting the Schumer-Rounds UAP Disclosure Act. The legislation included a provision for the federal government to exercise eminent domain over any retrieved non-human technology held by private defense contractors, a legal mechanism that by its very inclusion implies the authors of the legislation believed such technology exists. Significant portions of the act were stripped before passage under lobbying pressure from the defense industry. The government has neither confirmed nor denied the specific claims. That silence, applied to sworn testimony reviewed by the Inspector General as credible and urgent, is not neutral. It is a position. These 10 events, from a plan to detonate a nuclear weapon on the moon, to the systematic erasure of 78 deaths from history, to a satellite that nearly ended civilization over sunlight on clouds, to sworn congressional testimony about non-human technology in government custody, are the fraction of the record that cracked open. They are the documents that survived the classification. They are the witnesses who chose to speak despite being ordered not to. What they reveal is not comfortable. The distance between what governments knew and what they disclosed has, for decades, been vast enough to contain wars, catastrophes, and encounters with things that have no name in any official record. The silence of governments is not the absence of truth. It is the shape of something they decided you were not ready to know. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And subscribe for more.